All right, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome back for week number 2. We do, as you know, have kind of a strange schedule on this course in that we have a limited number of Zoom sessions because of starting when we started. So we didn't have that last week in May as a session. So this is technically our second session together. As you also know, then next Monday is a holiday. It's Juneteenth, and so we will not be having a Zoom session next Monday. So we have 2 weeks off. So we have class tonight. We don't have class next Monday. Then we will have class again 2 weeks from tonight on the 26th. So again, kind of a unusual type of schedule that we are juggling for this version of the course. Since we are not meeting again after tonight until the 26th, you do have some assignments that are coming up between now and then. So just as a refresher, what you have coming up is you have your background paper, and the background paper, again, is this very brief 3 or so page paper where you tell me about the issue or the problem that you're going to be using for the course assignments. Tell me about the problem, tell me about some of the background of the problem, who's involved in the problem, where the problem came from, if it's a relatively new problem, or it's a problem that's been around for a while. If it's been around for a while, what previous attempts has the organization made to try and address the problem? But again, very brief, about 3-page assignment, just to introduce me to the issue or the problem that you plan on using. So that's your background paper, and that one is due by midnight then next Sunday on June 18th. I've already received, I think, maybe 5 or 6 papers and have graded those and returned those. And I think so far so good. Those papers are all exactly what I'm looking for. And again, just a very brief description will certainly get the job done. Then you also have a couple more Canvas assignments that are coming due. You have Canvas number 2, which looks at differences between public and private organizations. Some of the information that we're going to cover in the first half of class tonight, comparing your organization to a private organization. If you're currently working in a public organization, you're currently working in a private organization, comparing it to the public organizations, and showing 2 differences between your organization and a private organization, or depending if you're in a private organization, 2 differences with a public organization. And you've got that Canvas essay number 2. Again, no responses to classmates required, just that one initial post is all we're requiring this term. That is then due on the 18th as well. Then you have Canvas essay number 3 that will be coming due before we're together again on the 26th. That's due on the 25th. And on that Canvas essay, you will just be distilling what you gave me in your background paper into a couple of paragraphs, and then sharing with your classmates the issue or the problem that you will be using as the topic for your course assignments. Now, again, you can be generic if you like in terms of your organization. You don't have to identify your organization. You can refer to it as a large organization in this region, or however you want to do it, or you can refer to the organization just as X organization. So you don't have to actually share the name of the organization unless you are comfortable doing so. So you've got those 2 Canvas essays, no responses required to classmates, and your background paper. Those 3 things will be due then before we get back together again in 2 weeks on June the 26th. I have gone through and I have reviewed the first Canvas essay, and I think everyone got full credit on that. I thought they were all well done. They were well written. They were proofread and addressed the topic well. So I think just continue doing what you did on that first Canvas essay for all of our future Canvas essays, and I think everything will work out very well. Okay, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping just so we're all on the same page in terms of what is due between now and when we get back together again as a class on the 26th. Any questions or anything at all about those upcoming assignments? Okay, very good. Let me double check, make sure we are recording, which we are. Then what I have on the schedule for tonight is in the first half of class tonight to talk more about these differences between public and private organizations, primarily with the focus on what these differences mean then for effectiveness. Now, I know that differences between public and private sectors, you have covered this information in the program up to this point in time, probably ad nauseum. So you're very familiar with a lot of the generic differences between the two sectors. But what I would like to do tonight is to talk about those differences with an eye on what they mean for measuring and achieving effectiveness in our organizations. I thought we would do that in the first half of class tonight. Then we'll take a brief break. And then the second half of class, we will turn our attention to environmental analysis. And we'll talk about the environment of public organizations, the environment of the public sector, and what differences in the environment mean for, again, how we measure and how we achieve effectiveness in our organizations. So those are the two topics we'll cover tonight. That will then set the stage for, in 2 weeks from tonight, then we'll be able to get into a discussion of the impact of missions and strategic plans and goals and objectives and what they mean for effectiveness in our organizations. And then also probably be able to focus on the different models of effectiveness. And I'll introduce you to 4 different models of effectiveness that we can discuss in 2 weeks as well. All right. So let's go ahead without further ado, if there are no questions, and go ahead and get into our information on some of these differences between public and private sectors and what those differences mean for our measurement and achievement of effectiveness. So just like everything else in this class, every topic we cover, we're always going to return to the issue of what does it mean for effectiveness? Basically answering that question I like so much, that big so what question. Well, so what? We have these differences between public and private organizations. So what? What do these differences mean for effectiveness? Now, you're all very familiar with differences between public and private sector organizations. Whenever we ask what's the main difference between a public and a private sector organization, the basic answer we always get is, well, in the public sector, there's no bottom line. In the private sector, there's a profit motivation, and that profit motivation will have an impact upon the behaviors exhibited in those private organizations. However, in a public organization, you typically are nonprofit, so therefore you don't have that profit motivation, you don't have that bottom line. And I think that's what we call a necessary but yet not sufficient definition of the difference between the sectors. That is a necessary difference to talk about, but it is not solely sufficient for distinguishing between public and private organizations. Because we do know that there are some private organizations that are nonprofit in orientation. So you can have private nonprofit organizations. And so just being a private organization does not necessarily mean that you always have a profit motivation and incentive. But I think we can all agree that public and private organizations oftentimes exist for different types of purposes. Public sector, typically, unless we are a government corporation or unless we are a government-sponsored enterprise, a GSE, we're probably not going to be doing a lot of the things we do in order to generate a profit. Now, we know that we have the existence of public organizations and the existence of public programs and public budgets primarily because of market failures. And you're probably all familiar with the idea of the market failure. A market failure is not a pejorative term. A market failure simply means that the private sector either chooses not to provide or produce a good or service, or simply does not have the capacity to provide and produce a good or a service. And because of that failure in the market to do it, then it creates this void, this vacuum that then the public sector has to then step in and create and provide and produce these goods and services. I do like to say provide and produce differently, and you'll hear me all tonight saying provide and or produce, because provision and production are 2 separate things. Provision is giving the resources to make production possible. Production's the actual creation of a good or a service or a product. So what we are doing tonight in this class would be considered the production of MPA education. The provision will be the resources that are paid through tuition that then make it possible for a course like this to happen. So there is a difference between provision and production. That's an important difference, because in some situations, we will have the public sector doing both provision as well as production, as we typically have with public goods. Sometimes you'll have the private sector doing both provision and production, as you have with private sector goods. But oftentimes we'll see a mix and match between the two. where you may have public provision and private sector production. There are a few isolated instances where you could have private provision and public production, but it's important to make this provision production distinction because it really does show us all the different gradations of public involvement in the creation of these goods and these services. So when the private sector fails to produce these goods and services, that's when we end up having public organizations and what we consider to be public goods. Which then kind of begs the question of what's the difference between a public and a private good? So let me put it to you and ask you, what is the difference between what we consider to be a public good and a private good? How do we distinguish between public and private goods?
Whoever owns it.
Yeah, whoever owns it. Certainly ownership is an important part of whether it's something that's a public good versus a private good. So ownership, and later on today, as we go through our slides, we'll talk about ownership as one of the primary ways that we can distinguish between public and private sector organizations. Anything else? Any other differences between public and private goods?
Who's able to use it, like who has access to it?
Sure. Yeah, who has access to it? Sometimes we will see in the public sector, public organizations have a monopoly. They have coercive power, and so they are the only game in town, essentially. And so they can kind of pick and choose how people consume goods and can subsidize the consumption of goods for some beneficiaries as opposed to other beneficiaries. But when you think about two different goods, you think about something like the classic public good of national defense, and you compare it to a classic private good, such as, my favorite candy bar, Three Musketeers bar, there are some substantial differences between those two types of goods. And those substantial differences usually run along the lines of things such as exhaustibility and excludability. So the question we then ask is, in terms of exhaustibility, can a good be exhausted? Can a good be used up? So if a good can be exhausted, that then makes consumers rivals for that good. So that Three Musketeers bar is exhaustible in that there's one Three Musketeers bar on the shelf of the store. You are younger and you are in better shape than I am, so you get in there and you get that candy bar before I'm able to get it. You consuming that candy bar exhausts it, so there's no candy bar left for me to consume. That's a characteristic of a pure private good. It is exhaustible. It can be used up. Consumers are rivals for the benefits from consuming that good. And then there's a question of excludability. Can we exclude people from partaking in the benefits of consuming that good? In a private sector good, we can exclude people. So with that candy bar, it's private because we can say this candy bar costs $1. If you walk in that store and you do not have $1 to pay for that candy bar, then you don't get to consume that candy bar. You are excluded from partaking in the benefits of consuming that candy bar. With a pure public good like national defense, it's difficult to exclude people from the benefits of national defense. It's also very difficult to charge people for the benefits they get from consuming national defense. So if you have two neighbors living next door to each other, and they are both going to benefit from national defense, you can't say neighbor A gets national defense and neighbor B does not get national defense. Perhaps neighbor A has this irrational fear that we are going to be invaded by Canada. And so because of that irrational fear, they get derive much more of a benefit from knowing that national defense exists than their neighbor who does not have that same rational fear. So it's not easy to charge when you're dealing with public goods because those public goods tend to be non-exclusive. It's very difficult for you to exclude people from the benefits of those public goods. So public goods tend to be non-excludable and non-exhaustible. Private goods tend to be excludable and exhaustible. Well, that then begs our favorite question of, well, so what? Well, what does that mean? What that means for us is that if we have public agencies that are providing and producing public goods, those public goods tend to lack the same empirical performance indicators and productivity indicators as you would have with a private sector good. If you have a candy bar, then you can measure very easily the productivity of that company that makes that candy bar. You can look at their profits, you can look at the number of units that they move, and that will give you some indications of effectiveness for that private corporation that's making that candy bar. Much more difficult for us to do that with pure public goods. But just talking about pure public goods and pure private goods, I think that kind of binary distinction does a disservice for us, because we have to realize that there are other types of goods as well that fall in that gray area between a pure public good and a pure private good. So if a pure public good is both non-excludable and non-exhaustible, and a pure private good is just the opposite, it is excludable and it is exhaustible, what about if you have a good that is excludable but non-exhaustible? Or if you have a good that is exhaustible but non-excludable? Well, you've got two other types of goods that kind of fall in this gray area between pure public and pure private goods. Those are what we call toll goods and common pool goods. So with a toll good, and you may have run into this distinction before in the program, but in a toll good is very much like a toll road. So you pull up to that toll road, you pay the money, the gate goes up, you drive on the toll road, you pull up there, you don't have the money, the gate stays down, you're excluded from driving on the toll road. Toll goods are excludable. However, they are non-exhaustive, because if everyone pays the toll, everyone gets to drive on that toll road. So toll goods are excludable but non-exhaustible. The converse, the flip side of a toll good, is what we call a common pool good. And a common pool good is a good in which it's difficult for us to exclude people from getting the benefits of that good, but that good can be exhausted, it can be used up. So you think about things like natural resources, minimal rights to mineral pools, things like that. It's difficult for us to exclude people, members of the public, from having access to it. But once people start accessing it, it can be used up and it can be exhausted. Well, again, the question is, well, so what? What does this mean for effectiveness? The so what answer is that pure public goods tend to be provided and produced by public organizations. Pure private goods tend to be provided and produced by private organizations. And those are pretty clear distinctions for us. Where the waters get a little muddied is in between with toll goods and common pool goods. When a good has some private components and yet some public components to it, that's where we argue a lot about what is the proper sector to be providing and producing this good or service. And so essentially when we privatize, we move things from the public sector to the private sector, we have privatized most of the goods that are easy to privatize. So most of the goods that used to be provided and produced by government that do have some private sector components to them, the majority of those goods have already been privatized. We're now in the realm of talking about privatizing goods that are more difficult to privatize, goods that have more public components to them. Things such as, privatizing education. We talk a lot about privatizing education and try and make it more efficient and make it more effective. Well, we argue about that because education has both public as well as private components to it. Privatizing prisons and criminal justice, again, we argue a lot about that because prisons have both public as well as private components to them. But the importance here is that when we're talking about measuring effectiveness, it is more difficult usually to measure the effectiveness of public goods as compared to private goods. And one of the problems with measuring the effectiveness of public goods is that public goods carry with them a lot of what we call free riders, that people will gain benefits from these public goods without actually paying for these public goods. And so it makes it more difficult for us to really know the entire scope of the consequences of this public good that we are creating. Therefore, makes it much more difficult for us to measure the effectiveness of those public goods that we are providing and producing. We also know that when we provide and produce goods, especially public goods, can result in a lot of externalities and spillovers. And I'm sure you've talked about externalities in a class before. Externalities are those consequences, those unintended consequences of actions. So if we have our widget factory, as our economists tell us, up on that hill, and that widget factory is making widgets. In the process of making those widgets, that widget factory may pollute the river that runs behind the hill. That pollution is considered to be a negative externality. It was not intended, but it was an artifact of producing this widget. It's negative, obviously, because it's pollution. And whenever we have a good that produces a negative externality, that good tends to be overproduced. And it tends to be overproduced because that widget factory, whenever they decide how many widgets to produce, they're not going to take into account the cost of the pollution in that river that they're polluting. That's not going to be part of their business decision-making calculus. And so they won't take into account those costs. And so that reduces the cost, which then makes them overproduce that good. So goods that produce negative externalities tend to be overproduced. Goods that could result in positive externalities tend to be underproduced. So again, goods that result in negative externalities are overproduced. Goods that result in positive externalities tend to be underproduced. So you think about a positive externality could be an unintended consequence that actually has a positive, a good effect on the community and on society. So the childhood immunization program that's being provided to families below a certain income eligibility level. The primary beneficiaries of those childhood immunization programs will be those eligible families whose children are being immunized. However, when those children are immunized, hopefully that means there'll be less disease in the surrounding society, the surrounding community, and that's a positive benefit, a positive externality that will then flow to all those other free riders who are not actually participating in this childhood immunization program. The problem is when you have a good that produces a lot of positive externalities, whomever is creating that good and deciding how much of that good to create, they are not going to take into account all those positive consequences that are occurring to people who are not consuming directly that good or that service. Whenever you decide how much of a good or service to make, you have your demand and supply curve, your supply demand curve, and you will then make a amount of supply that is equivalent to the demand for that good. Well, there may be a lot of demand out there among all these free riders because of positive externalities, but you're not going to know what that demand is. You're only going to make enough of a supply to meet the demand of people that are actually consuming this good directly. And everyone who's getting an indirect benefit, you're not going to take into account the positive benefits that they are getting, which then leads you to underproduce a good or service that produces a positive externality. So this calls for regulation, both in terms of trying to reduce the production of something that creates a negative externality and to subsidize the production of a good that results in a positive externality. This is where a lot of your regulation comes into play. As you're probably familiar, we have three main categories of policy in this country. We have distributive policies, we have redistributive policies, and we have regulatory policies. The vast majority of our policies tend to be redistributive, where we are redistributing wealth from one segment of society to another. And they also tend to be regulatory, where we are regulating industry and the behavior of others in order to try and account for these positive and these negative externalities. Regulatory policies present us with a different type of challenge in terms of measuring effectiveness and measuring the achievement of our goals, because the goals that we're trying to achieve with regulatory policy will probably be much different than the goals that we are trying to achieve with redistributive policy. Public organizations engage in both redistributive as well as regulatory policies. And so it, again, makes it a little bit more difficult for us to measure effectiveness in the public sector. So we have public organizations, we have public expenditures because of market failures, because of externalities and spillovers, but we also have public organizations and expenditures because of the political rationale known as expectancy theory. So whenever there is a crisis situation, typically in a crisis situation, you would anticipate that government will get involved in provision and production to try and alleviate that crisis. You think about a recession, or the classic example is obviously the Great Depression. And the Great Depression, you had the FDR administration that was creating all these different agencies and all these different programs to help pull the country out of the depths of the Great Depression. So the federal government starts to get very much involved in provision and production of goods and services that prior to that had been left either to local governments or had been left to the private sector. Once you start getting government involved in providing and producing goods and services in response to a crisis, you would think that once that crisis is then gone, we've gotten past that crisis, that the level of government service and involvement would then return to its normal level. But we know that does not happen. We know that involvement of government in the economy tends to continue to increase even after a crisis has been averted. And the reason for that is a political explanation of expectancy theory. As people come to expect governments to provide and produce goods and services, governments then have to continue providing those goods and services because the public have come to expect that government will be doing these types of things. Those raised expectations then create a challenge for us in terms of trying to be effective as government organizations, because we're being asked to do more and more, and oftentimes being asked to do more and more with fewer and fewer resources, which then makes it more difficult for us to be effective. So this distinction between public and private sectors is important for us because it does have important implications for how we measure effectiveness in the public sector and how we then achieve those effectiveness levels. Another major difference between public and private sectors is in terms of the values that underpin public and private organizations. And these values obviously will have direct import for effectiveness. So in the private sector, since we are motivated by profit in the private sector, we are very much motivated by values such as efficiency and effectiveness. And those are the true primary values of most private sector organizations, and rightly so. If they are not efficient, if they are not effective, they're going to go out of business relatively quickly. So it's a matter of agency survival. However, in the public sector, we have a lot of additional values beyond just efficiency and effectiveness. We also have social equity concerns. We want to try and promote and maintain social equity. We're very concerned about the distribution, the equitable distribution of resources across society. Social equity is one of the primary values of public administration, especially in the wake of George Frederickson and the new public administration movement of a few decades ago. Social equity is a major value in the public sector. The protection of individual rights is another important value in the public sector. We have what we call qualified good faith immunity as public administrators. Qualified good faith immunity means that we must know the constitutional rights of those who we deal with and endeavor not to violate those rights. That is why whenever I teach the introductory course, the Environment of Public Administration course, I always start out with the Constitution. And we always go through the Constitution and make sure that we understand what the basic constitutional rights of individuals are so that we can then endeavor not to violate those rights as administrators. So we protect individual rights in the public sector, another important value. but we are operating within a political environment. We'll talk more about this in the second half of class tonight, but because our environment is political, because we serve these, as we call, many masters in the public sector, we also have to engage in political responsiveness. We also have to be very mindful of being responsive to elected officials. If you're not responsive to elected officials, you're going to lose political support. You lose that political support, you're going to lose appropriations. You lose appropriations and you lose the lifeblood of your organization. Another one is representative bureaucracy. Representative bureaucracy, we want our bureaucracy to represent the people that bureaucracy is serving. And that's why we have affirmative action and equal employment opportunity. That's why we have our applicant pools that need to be certified by for equity and for diversity. So we have a lot of these additional values in the public sector, and the implication of that for effectiveness is that measuring effectiveness is more complex in the public sector. It's not just about have we achieved our goals. It's not just about how many units we have sold. It's not just about the unit cost or the marginal cost of each additional unit that we are creating. Those are good measures of efficiency and effectiveness, but those are measures that the private sector focuses primarily on. In the public sector, we have to balance that focus on efficiency with social equity, protection of individual rights, political responsiveness, representative bureaucracy, and a myriad of other values that sometimes can run counter to a value such as efficiency. At times, efficiency will run counter to social equity. Efficiency will run counter to the protection of individual rights. Protecting individual rights will take us time. It will take a lot of attention. It will mean understanding who we are dealing with and making sure not to violate those rights. That's going to take a lot more time and effort than if you're not that worried about the protection of individual rights. As Mark Moore tells us, whenever public sector gets involved in the provision or production of goods and services, it is oftentimes displacing private sector resources. And so the value of the public sector doing this, providing and producing this good or service, must outweigh the cost of losing those private sector, displacing those private sector resources. In other words, what Moore tells us is that it's not just about efficiency in the public sector, it's about all these other underlying values. And when we try and measure effectiveness, we have to realize that effectiveness is multidimensional and takes into account a lot of these values beyond just did we achieve our goal, or beyond just the balance between inputs and outputs. And there's a lot more to measuring effectiveness in the public sector than oftentimes in a private sector organization. Now, up to this point in time, again, I think we have taken a less nuanced approach to talking about public and private organizations. We've kind of set up this dichotomy of it's a public organization or it's a private organization. And we all know that that's not a completely accurate view of the actual spectrum of publicness versus privateness, if you will. And that there are different gradations of organizations along the spectrum running from private to public in nature. And on this next screen, you can kind of see that gradation across that spectrum. So you start at the top right-hand corner, you have your purely private types of organizations. And so a private enterprise is a private organization. It is not governmentally owned. It's very slightly regulated. It is a private organization, a private corporation. If you move to the left, you'll see private corporations that are subject to government regulations. This is going to be the majority of your private sector organizations. Organizations that are subject to regulations such as occupational safety and health, OSHA regulations. And most of our private corporations, depending on the goods that they are producing, will oftentimes be subject to these types of government regulations. Then you move to your left, you have private corporations that receive a significant amount of funding from government contracts. Now, most of their revenue comes from private sources, but they do get a lot of their revenue, a minority, but still a lot of the revenue from contracts with government organizations. Whenever private corporations sign contracts with the public sector, it really opens them up to a lot of additional regulations. They almost become somewhat quasi-public in nature. Then to the left of that, you have heavily regulated private firms, such as privately owned utilities. Privately owned utilities are subject to a lot of regulation in terms of how they distribute these utilities, any types of rate increases that they want to charge. They usually have to go through a utility commission in order to have those approved. Those are very heavily regulated private types of corporations. Then to the left of that, you have private corporations that are reliant upon government contracts for most of their revenue. So things like defense contractors, the majority of the revenue will come from government contracts. Then to the left of that, you have these private nonprofit organizations that are almost completely reliant upon government contracts and government grants. That if you shift to the top of the screen, those 6 categories there, those are organizations that are privately owned, but there are different gradations to just how private they are, but they are privately owned. Then below the line at the bottom of the chart is where you have government-owned organizations. And so again, you would do the same type of thing. And so you see on the right side, government program or agency that's operated largely through the purchase from private vendors. So things like purchasing from Medicare, public housing, government-sponsored enterprises or GSEs that are established by government, but they have shares that get traded on the stock market, like Fannie Mae is an example of a government-sponsored enterprise. Then to the left of that, you have government corporations like the U.S. Postal Service, the Tennessee Valley Authority, Port Authority of Nevada. And then to the left of that, you get to your extreme end of the scale with your true government agency, a true government organization. But the importance of this chart, obviously, is to show us that it's not binary. It's not just private enterprise versus government agency. There are a lot of different gradations along the way between being a private entity and being a government agency. So I just think it's important that we keep that in mind, that there are a lot of gradations between the public side of the spectrum and the private side of the spectrum. All, again, where you are at in that spectrum will have an impact upon how you measure effectiveness in your organization. Now, earlier when we were talking about differences between public and private sector, I think as Richard had said, a big difference is ownership. And this chart then tells you, well, there are 2 ways we can look at differences between public and private organizations. We can look at them in terms of ownership, who owns them, are they public or privately owned? And then who funds them, are they publicly or privately funded? Top left, your pure government agency like the Department of Defense, Social Security Administration, publicly owned and publicly funded primarily through taxes. The bottom right, you have your pure private organization like General Motors and IBM, privately owned, privately funded. Then in the middle, in this gray area, you can then have in the top right of the screen, privately owned and publicly funded, such as defense contractors. And then at the bottom left of the screen, publicly owned and privately funded, such as the U.S. Postal Service and some of your government-sponsored enterprises. So again, another way we can distinguish between different types of organizations, who owns them, and then how are they funded. Then to build on that, we can also ask the question, where does their authority, where does their legitimacy come from? Now, on this screen, you'll see the Y and the X axis. On the X axis, you have political authority. On the Y axis, you have economic authority. The more you move to the right on the X axis, the more you move toward authority coming from the political world, coming from enabling legislation, coming from legislative bodies. That's where your authority, your legitimacy comes from. As you move to the top of the Y axis, you move more toward economic authority, where your authority, your legitimacy comes from the market, from the free market itself. So private firms are at the top left-hand corner, government agencies at the bottom right-hand corner, and then you can see all the different types of organizations arrayed on the table, depending upon where they fall in terms of political authority versus private sector economic authority. So that's another way of looking at differences between public and private organizations. And then another way in which we can distinguish between public and private organizations is to add on this idea of a mode of social control to our previous discussion of ownership and funding. So we can ask the question, who owns the organization? How is the organization funded for either public or private sources? And then what's the mode of social control? Is it controlled in a polyarchy, meaning it's controlled by society as a government organization would be? Or is it more of a mode of social control, such as a market control, in that there's being controlled by decisions made in the private sector market, within the free market? So a government bureau, government agency, publicly owned, publicly funded, mode of social control, a polyarchy, much like the Bureau of Labor Statistics as an example. Government corporations, publicly owned, privately funded, but still the mode of social control is polyarchy because they are still publicly owned. Government-sponsored enterprise, they are privately owned, they are publicly funded, but they still consider a mode of social control of polyarchy because they do have that strong funding that's coming from the public sector. Regulated enterprises are privately owned, privately funded, but they are so heavily regulated that a lot of their control comes from those governmental regulations, putting them in the polyarchy category. GSEs, government-sponsored enterprises, publicly funded, publicly owned, market-based type of mode of social control. State-owned enterprises, publicly owned, privately funded, market control. Government contractors, privately owned, publicly funded, market control. And then finally, private enterprises, privately owned, privately funded, and controlled by the free market. Again, just adding mode of social control as another way to distinguish between public and private sector organizations. So again, the big takeaway from these past 4 slides is just there are gradations to this idea of the publicness of an organization. It's not just a binary distinction, public or private, but rather there are a lot of gradations in between. And where your organization falls in those gradations in between will then have important implications for what your values are as an organization, and therefore how you then identify and measure effectiveness. So as we'll talk about in the second half of class tonight, there are also some major environmental factors that distinguish between public and private organizations. One, again, this source of funding, and there are important implications. When an organization is funded through government appropriations, those appropriations tend to be much more stable in nature than if you're funded through the profits from selling a good or a service. Since your source of funding is much more stable in a public organization, then you're not as responsive oftentimes to changes in the market and changes in the economy. Sometimes some will say it leads to lower efficiency in the public sector because you are not as motivated by cost reduction or achieving operating efficiency because you know you're going to get appropriations in future years. And so by being reliant upon appropriations has led some government organizations, some will say, to be less efficient than their private sector counterparts. We also know we have a lot of very elaborate legal constraints in the public sector through the many masters theory of being overseen by the legislature and the executive branch and the courts. And because of all these very intensive, elaborate, formal legal constraints, it limits the ability of us to be creative and innovative at times. It constrains our operations and our procedures, leaving less autonomy for managers in making choices. A lot of top-down formal authority that we deal with in public sector organizations. We also know we deal in a very political type of environment. So there are a lot of external political influences that are placed upon more public organizations. We have to engage in political bargaining. We have to engage in lobbying. We have to be very mindful of public opinion, interest group, client, and constituent pressures. Will also have impacts upon our decision-making and how we achieve our goals in the public sector. We need to build this support among client groups and constituencies because, as Norton Long tells us, political parties don't provide us the political support that they do in a lot of European nations. And since we don't get political support as administrators from political parties, we have to go out there and be political. We have to go out there and build support among client groups and constituency groups ourselves in order to secure the existence of our organizations and agencies. The transactions are obviously different between public and private sector organizations. In the public sector, we deal with a lot of externalities. If we're involved in the production of public goods, we're going to have to handle some significant externalities. We also don't have a ready-made pricing mechanism in the public sector like you do in the private sector. In the private sector, you can calculate the optimal price point, and the optimal price point that will bring you in the most profit while not reducing consumption of a good or service. And you can do that because you can calculate what's called the price elasticity of the goods and services that you are creating. Price elasticity speaks to if the price goes up, demand's going to go down. And that's sometimes easier to calculate that in the private sector than it is in the public sector. In the public sector, a lot of our activities can be coercive, they can be monopolistic, they can be sometimes even unavoidable for people, that people have no choice but to consume products and goods that are being created by government. And because of that, then again, there's a little bit less of an imperative to try and be efficient in the creation of these goods and these services. Government activities tend to have a broader impact and a greater symbolic significance. A lot of the actions of government agencies tend to be what we call expository in nature, meaning that they really do send out signals and they send out clues to society about what is valued and what is not valued and behaviors that are valued on the part of government. And so there's a lot of that signaling that is done by government organizations, and the scope of what government organizations do will be much larger than the scope of what we oftentimes see in a private corporation. We all know about the greater scrutiny and the fishbowl effect in the public sector, which has an impact again then on the measurement of effectiveness. And then, as we said, we have the balancing of these values. We have to balance fairness and responsiveness and openness, transparency, accountability with effectiveness and efficiency. So a lot more to balance in the public sector than oftentimes in a private organization. In the public sector, we oftentimes have greater goal ambiguity, multiplicity, and conflict. We have more vague, intangible goals that are more difficult to measure. Oftentimes, these goals are provided to us by the enabling agency, the enabling legislation. And so when you don't have specificity in your goals, it makes it more difficult for you to know how to achieve those goals and when those goals are being achieved. We also have a multiplicity of goals and criteria. Again, we're balancing all these different values, and we're also balancing goals provided to us by different organizations. So the legislature may have a different goal for our agency than the executive does. So this multiplicity of goals then can lead to a lot of goal conflict. And when those goals conflict with each other, then we have to make decisions about trade-offs. Efficiency versus transparency, or efficiency versus due process or social equity. And we have to make these difficult value-laden decisions about trade-offs between these different values in the public sector. We also know, again, that the public sector is oftentimes subject to a lot more interventions and a lot more interruptions than what we might see in the private sector. Our strategic planning processes tend to be much more subject to interruption, much more subject to what we refer to as fire drills that we are put through. That again makes it more difficult for us to plan, to create our goals, and then to create strategic plans for the achievement of those goals. In the public sector, public managers have less decision-making autonomy and flexibility because of all of these constraints and all these external political influences. We have to balance collective bargaining agreements with career civil service requirements. Balancing CBAs with career civil service requirements means a lot more constraints, a lot more limitations than if you were dealing with an at-will employee. Collective bargaining career civil service regulations then mean that public managers have much less authority over their subordinates than what you might think you would have in the private sector. They may have less control over personnel systems. They may have less control over procurement. And so just a lot less control for our managers. Less control for managers means more difficult for those managers to achieve effectiveness. There's also a resistance to the delegation of power and authority and decision-making in the public sector. Because public sector managers are so limited because of all these different constraints, they oftentimes want to hold on to information because information is a power source for them. So they fill the void in power that they have because of all these constraints with information. So sometimes public managers don't want to give out that information. They don't want to delegate decision-making and delegate power and authority to subordinates because that's giving up more power, and they're already very limited in the amount of power and authority that they currently have. A great deal of turnover. I know just reading the background papers that have come in to date, a lot of people are focusing on turnover, and turnover is a major issue in the public sector. When you have a lot of turnover of top leaders due to elections or changing political appointments, it makes it more difficult, obviously, for us to try and accomplish our objectives and our goals. Structurally, we know that, and you've had an organization theory exposure in the course before, the program before, so you're very familiar with the importance of structure to understanding organizations. And you also know that public organizations tend to have elaborate bureaucratic structures. And as organizations get older, we had mentioned this in our previous class, they become more institutionally rigid and they start fragmenting and they start developing more and more elaborate structures and more elaborate policies and procedures that oftentimes can conflict with each other. Now, some recent literature takes issue with this and says, well, there's red tape in the private sector as well. There are bureaucratic structures in the private sector as well. But I think that we can all agree that our public organizations, especially our older ones, tend to have these very stringent organization structures, what Douglas McGregor would have called a theory X type of organization that makes it somewhat difficult for us to have the flexibility to be creative in achieving our goals and our objectives. We know we do strategic planning in both the public as well as the private sector, but our strategic planning processes in the public sector tend to be much more subject to interventions and interruptions and much greater involvement of external authorities in the strategic planning process. So it's more difficult for us to strategically plan and then to carry out these plans, oftentimes in public organizations. Incentive structures are different as well. And so if you want to be effective as an organization and you define that effectiveness as either achieving your goals or satisfying your stakeholders, oftentimes the way in which you do that is by incentivizing employees to be more productive. It's easier to incentivize employees in the private sector compared to the public sector because of the absence of pay for performance in a lot of public organizations. Now, that absence for pay for performance is sometimes due to union resistance to pay for performance. Sometimes it's because legislatively we don't have the ability, we don't have the authority to use pay for performance. Sometimes it's because it's just so much more difficult for us to come up with empirical performance indicators that makes it next to impossible for us then to attach compensation to those performance levels. And so in the public sector, we tend to focus more on intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic rewards. And a lot of studies have shown that public sector employees respond more to those intrinsic as opposed to extrinsic rewards. One of the things you'll see, though, is there is a study that's produced by the Office of Personnel Management, and we'll talk about it in a future course, and I've included it in our Canvas site. And one of the things that that study looks at, it looks at the satisfaction of federal employees and how engaged federal employees are in their organizations and in their daily jobs. And one of the things that they're very dissatisfied about is they're oftentimes dissatisfied about the way in which rewards are allocated within their agencies. And they feel that people who are performing well do not receive the rewards they should get, and people who are performing poorly do not receive the punitive measures that they should get for their poor performance. So sometimes we do struggle because of collective bargaining agreements and career civil service requirements. We sometimes struggle with those rewards and handing out those rewards in an equitable manner to really reflect good performance versus poor performance. This sometimes has led to lower satisfaction levels among public employees. And I think it is true that when you do look at the literature compares satisfaction levels among public versus private employees. For the most part, public employee satisfaction level tends to be a little bit lower than what we see in the private sector. But levels of satisfaction among employees in both the public as well as the private sector still tend to be consistently high, in that most employees are relatively satisfied in their jobs. It's just public employees tend to be just a little tick lower in terms of their satisfaction level as compared to their private sector counterparts. Again, in the public sector, because of the lack of these incentives, because of the difficulty in terms of coming up with empirical performance measures, especially quantitative performance measures, there's a finding that in the public sector, public employees tend to be a bit more cautious in terms of what they do and not quite as innovative as their private sector counterparts. Now, again, the evidence for this is a little bit mixed. I think it is true that because of all the limitations and constraints, public sector employees do tend to be a little hesitant to be innovative and creative. And so there can be a little bit more cautiousness, if you will, on the part of public sector employees. But for the most part, public as well as private employees still tend to be relatively productive as well as relatively satisfied in their positions. Now, this whole discussion that we've just had about some of the distinctive characteristics between public organizations and private organizations really does underscore what Graham Allison tells us in his article. And I included that article by Graham Allison as one of our e-reserved readings. I hope you had a chance to at least take a quick look at it. But the argument that Allison makes in comparing public and private organizations is that the general functions in the public and the private sector, those general functions seem to be equivalent between the two sectors. That in both sectors, we have to do the basic functions of management. We have to staff organizations. We have to do strategic planning. We have to direct operations. We have to coordinate. We have to raise money, bring in our budgets and manage our budgets. We have to do all these things in both the public as well as the private sector. So Allison argues it's not really in the what category that differs between public and private, it's in the how category. It's not what is being done, but rather the difference is in how it is being done. How we staff our organizations is different in the public sector compared to the private sector. And a couple of people in their background papers talked about the problem they want to focus on was the problem of onboarding and bringing people into the organization and how slow it is and how long it takes to recruit and hire people into a public organization. Now, that's the result of a lot of the constraints, a lot of the limitations that we have in the different value structures that we have in our public organizations. So how we hire people, how you hire a career civil servant, is going to be different than how you hire an at-will employee in the private sector. How you budget is going to be different between the public and the private sector. Public sector, as we talked about, you're more reliant upon appropriations, which are much more stable in nature. Your appropriations are coming from elected officials, from legislative bodies. In the private sector, it's not quite as stable because your resources are coming from profits of selling commodities. And so therefore you have different ways in which you are generating money and ways in which you are managing that money. A lot more public transparency and oversight over how we manage our money, our resources in the public sector as compared to how it is done in the private sector. So I think all of this underscores this idea that the functions are similar between the sectors, but the how we do those functions, that's what differs between a public organization and a private organization. And then the so what of it all is, since it is different how we do these functions, then that's going to have an impact upon how we measure effectiveness as well. And so, since most of us are working in public organizations, what we're going to focus on primarily throughout the remainder of this course is, what does this mean then for how we measure effectiveness? And I think if you are measuring effectiveness in a public organization that's subject to all these constraints and limitations, all this scrutiny and oversight, dealing with appropriations, you're going to be measuring effectiveness much differently than if you were a private sector organization. So it suggests to us the need for a body of literature and an understanding of how measuring effectiveness in the public sector is unique and how it is different than how we do it in the private sector. So it just kind of sets the stage then for why it is different in terms of measuring effectiveness in the public sector as compared to how we do it in the private sector. But a lot of these differences in terms of our effectiveness in the public sector will all flow back to the different environments in which we operate in. In public organizations, we operate in a very heterogeneous environment as compared to the environment in the private sector. So in the second half of class, what I'd like to do is then take this information and then use it to turn our attention to an environmental analysis of how we do what we do in the public sector and what the environment means for how we can be effective in our public organizations. So in the second half of class, we'll then talk about an analysis of the public sector environment. We'll talk about capacity. We'll talk about heterogeneity of the environment and what all these environmental characteristics then mean for what we do in our organizations and how we measure the effectiveness of what we are doing. So I'll stop talking for a couple of minutes and let me ask you, based upon this information we presented in the first half of class tonight on public-private differences, any comments or any observations on any of this information? I know that you've talked about public and private differences throughout your entire MPA program, but one of the goals I have of this class is kind of tie things together and kind of bring a lot of the information you covered in the program together and put it into the service of making our organizations more effective. So this information is kind of, again, kind of by foundational background type of information that we can then use, hopefully, to resolve those problems that we are identifying within our individual organizations. So let's take a little bit of a break. I'll stop talking for a few minutes. Let's take about a 10-minute break because we only have a couple hours tonight. So let's say it's 7:02. Let's come back at 7:12. We come back at 7:12, then we'll shift into environmental analysis and we'll talk about some of the specific external as well as internal environmental factors that can have an impact upon organizational effectiveness. So come back at 7:12 and we'll do environment. Okay, we are back. I know that went by very quickly. I apologize for that, but since we only have 2 hours, a lot of information to cover in 2 hours. But in the second half of class tonight, now we're going to turn our attention to the environment, the impact that the environment has on effectiveness of organizations. And we're going to look at both external environmental factors as well as internal factors within the organization itself. So, in terms of the environment, the external environment, there are a lot of characteristics of the external environment that obviously can have an impact upon organizational effectiveness. One environmental characteristic is obviously capacity, the capacity of the environment to support the operations of the organization. And so when you think about environmental capacity, what types of things do you think of in terms of the capacity of the environment to support the organization? What elements in the environment can support an organization?
Like your tax base?
Sure. Yeah, the amount of wealth in the environment, certainly if you're reliant upon appropriations, the tax capacity in the environment in the jurisdiction could then have an impact upon your organization and having the resources you need to be effective as an organization. So absolutely, I think the monetary resources, we'll call it, or fiscal resources that the environment has to provide to the organization. What else? What other types of resources are in the environment?
I don't know, like land resources, like if you need a facility to run whatever service you're providing, like what's available to you.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you oftentimes will have jurisdictions. That's one of the ways in which they can, lure organizations into, especially private organizations, into their jurisdiction is by providing that infrastructure. And so we have some jurisdictions that will build out business parks and they'll provide the infrastructure in terms of the electricity, in terms of the sewer system, and we'll build all that out so that organization merely needs to come and locate there and then doesn't have to worry about any of those infrastructural supports. And so certainly I think infrastructure support can certainly be an important characteristic that organizations can rely upon. When you think you have to staff your organization, you have to get labor into your organization. So if the environment has a ready-made labor source, a labor pool, that has the requisite skills in order to do the jobs of the organization, that contributes to the capacity of the environment to support the organization. Political support. So if you have that political support on the part of elected officials, if you have that support on the part of citizens and interest groups within the environment, that political support obviously lends more capacity to the environment to support the organization. So you need to have an environment that has the capacity to support the organization for the organization to be effective at achieving its goals. Another characteristic of the environment is the homogeneity or heterogeneity of the environment. The more heterogeneous the environment is, the more challenges you may have in terms of there are a lot of different opinions, there are a lot of different perspectives on what the organization should be doing. And so that could then impact what the organization does on a daily basis and how that organization behaves. How stable or how turbulent the environment is. If it's a very static, very stable environment, there won't be as many challenges to the organization. If you're existing within a very turbulent environment, obviously those resources are going to be changing constantly, and your organization is going to have to be a lot more adaptive and more reactive to those turbulent changes in the environment. The amount of concentration or dispersion of resources within the environment can also have an impact upon the organization and its achievement of effectiveness. If you have very concentrated resources in your environment, if you already have an ability to tap into those resources, then obviously you're going to be fine. But if you have resources that are dispersed throughout the entire environment, then you're going to have to be searching for where those resources are and then tapping into different elements of the environment to generate those resources. And consensus dissensus. How much consensus of opinion is there in the environment? The more consensus there is, then the more direction you'll have as an organization in terms of how to serve the clientele from that environment. The more disagreement there is in the environment, obviously the more contentious it's going to be, probably the more turbulent the environment's going to be, and the more challenging it will be for the organization. So the environment, especially in terms of its stability or its turbulence, will have an impact upon the behaviors of the organization. Organizations that are in a very turbulent, very dynamic, very changing environment, they're probably going to have to change their definitions of what they consider to be effective on a very frequent basis. And so the external environment certainly can have a major impact upon your effectiveness as an organization. We know in the external environment, there are a lot of different political actors that will also impact your effectiveness as an organization. We know that's one of the major differences between a public and private organization is public organizations tend to be operating in much more political types of environments. So you have a legislature. The legislature will pass the enabling legislation that will create your agency, that will create the programs that you are implementing as an organization, and may actually require the types of goals that you need to achieve in order to be effective as an organization. Not only does the genesis of the organization come from the legislature, but the ongoing appropriations will obviously come from the legislative body as well. The more politically responsive you are to those elected officials, the more likely you are to be able to continue to tap in to those appropriations and those resources. Also, the legislature will be the primary overseer of the actions of that organization. So you will be held to account for your actions and your organization's effectiveness by those legislative committees. So legislature will play a very big role from the external environment perspective on what the organization does, how it measures and how it accomplishes effectiveness. Obviously, if you're a governmental agency, you are going to be located within the executive branch, either at the national government or the state government level. You are located within the executive branch. So therefore, you also have to be accountable to the executive. In terms of budget, when budget time comes around, if you're at the federal level, you have to submit your budget requests to the Office of Management and Budget for approval. If you're at the state level, you're submitting them to the Department of Finance. And so your budgets flow through the executive branch. You then be put into that executive level budget. So you're being held accountable by actors in the executive branch as well. The judiciary has become much more involved in shaping the functions and the activities of bureaucratic agencies. And so you're going to be held accountable by the courts in terms of the protection of individual rights and the promotion of social equity, and even to a degree efficiency in terms of how you are spending your appropriations, if you're doing it in a legal fashion. All of that's going to be subject to judicial scrutiny. And the courts have become much more involved in overseeing the actions of administrative agencies through the use of things such as structural remedies, where the courts will find that if an agency is violating the constitutional rights of individuals, then the court can issue a structural remedy. In essence, issue a writ of mandamus whereby they will tell an agency, you must take these types of actions in order to rectify this situation. And oftentimes you'll have to do that under a threat of civil or criminal penalties. Consent decrees are another example whereby agencies will be required to take certain types of actions, oftentimes to remedy actions that they have taken in the past that have either been discriminatory or have violated principles of social equity. So a lot of that oversight allow those remedies coming from the judicial system. Other agencies in the environment also will have an impact upon your agency. Sometimes we have to acquire resources from other agencies. If we may have to get office space or coordinate leases or maybe printing services with other governmental agencies. So we have to build relationships with those agencies in our external environment as well. Sometimes we compete against other agencies. If we are producing certain types of goods or implementing certain types of programs that have significant overlap with programs that are being provided by other agencies, sometimes you have those types of turf wars, and you have that conflict between agencies. Sometimes grants will require you to work with other agencies, and you'll have to demonstrate how you are working with other agencies in spending that grant money. Obviously, interest groups and constituent groups will have a big impact upon what we do as organizations. Since we have to always fight for appropriations with the legislature and we always have to contend with executive and judicial oversight, it is important for us to build client and constituent group support. And many public managers today have to build their own political repository of power in order to insulate their agency from a lot of these types of threats and challenges from the external environment. And then obviously the mass media will have an impact as a political actor as well. We know what has happened in the media recently. We know how media outlets have become much more opinion-based than they've ever been in the past. We know that as they become more opinion-based, we have some media outlets that tend to ascribe to one side of the political spectrum or the other side of the political spectrum. And so sometimes a media outlet will have an agenda in making contact with an agency. And so we have to know how to navigate through this new world of mass media. And the media, the scrutiny will have an impact upon our organizations, what we do, and how we do it. And so our environment is obviously a very political environment, and we have a variety of different political actors who will all have an impact upon what we are doing and our ability to be effective in terms of achieving the goals of our organization. But it's not just those external elements of the environment that are important to what we do as organizations. We also have an internal environment within our organization that we also have to take into account in achieving effectiveness as an organization. And a lot of these internal theories you've probably been introduced to before. If you had an organization behavior and theory course, you're probably familiar with a lot of these schools of thought and theories about organizations, structuring of organizations, and how that impacts the effectiveness of those organizations. So assuming that you've had organization behavior and theory before, I think this is information we can probably cover relatively quickly. But if you remember back to organization behavior, the organization literature really developed over the past 150 years by evolving through a series of different schools and perspectives. And the organization theory literature really kind of starts with what we call the classical school of organization theory. And the classical school of organization theory defines effectiveness as something that can be achieved through kind of this one-size-fits-all approach, that we can come up with this panacea, this one way of structuring our organizations or structuring the work within our organizations that will then make our organizations effective and efficient. And where the classical school usually starts is with our good friend Max Weber, who I know you've run into multiple times so far in the MPA program. So someone just give me a really quick synopsis of Max Weber and what he says about organizations.
He was the one that kind of formalized writing about bureaucracy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, exactly. He wrote a lot about bureaucracy. He really felt that bureaucracy was kind of the highest level of rationality. He really did believe that we need to make our decisions in our organizations based upon empirical evidence, that we shouldn't just make decisions on what we believe or what we feel, but we should collect empirical evidence and then make our decisions based on that empirical evidence. Weber came up with this whole theory of the ideal bureaucracy. And in his ideal bureaucracy, the ideal bureaucratic organization, in order to be effective, would have to be structured in terms of having this tall hierarchy. Remember that triangular type of shape to an organization. So a tall hierarchy where you have one position at the top. As you move down your hierarchy, you will then encounter more and more positions. So you have a tall top-down type of hierarchy. You have what he called a unity of command, whereby everyone knows to whom they are accountable. You have what he called a span of control, where every manager was responsible for a limited number of employees, maybe 3 or 5 or 7 employees. You would have what he called division of labor, where we would divide the work up among positions within our organization. And each person would then specialize in a certain type of tasks, known as specialization of task. As they specialize in certain tasks on a daily basis, that would then make them experts in doing those jobs. And so our organizations would be staffed by experts who are also professional career administrators. And everything that we did in the organization would be based upon written documentation. So we would develop rules and policies and procedures, and we would write those rules, policies, and procedures down in order to know how to deal with people in the future. So by using the rules, regulations, and policies that are written down in a uniform manner, we will then be able to treat everyone equally. And so all these different principles made up what he called the ideal bureaucratic structure. So for Weber, achieving effectiveness as an organization revolved around the structure of the organization. If we could structure all of our organizations in this ideal bureaucratic structure, then we could make all of our organizations effective and efficient. So for Weber, effectiveness was the result of having the right organization structure. And that best organization structure was this ideal bureaucratic structure. And so that's what Max Weber told us about effectiveness. If we could structure in this ideal bureaucratic structure, that's what will make our organization effective. Then another classical theorist, Frederick Taylor, who's best known for scientific management, also took on this idea of the one-size-fits-all approach in order to make us effective as an organization. But rather than structure, Frederick Taylor focused more on the process of work. And so does anyone remember scientific management and how scientific management worked?
Is it the one best way theory?
Absolutely, yep. It's the one best way to do a job. And that's what Taylor is most remembered for, is this: if we can come up with the one best way to do a job, and that one best way to do the job would then be the most effective and efficient way of doing the job. And if we can come up with this one best way to do a job, we can then teach this one best way to all the employees doing the job in our organization, then we can become effective as an organization. And so through scientific management, he did these time motion studies. Take the stopwatch and you time all the jobs being done in the organization, deconstruct every job into its component elements, get rid of all what he called the false movements, any movements that did not contribute to efficiency or effectiveness, then combine all the effective and efficient movements together, you would then have the one best way to do the job. Once you've identified the one best way to do the job, you then recruit people who have the requisite skills to do the job in the one best way. You then train them how to do the job in the one best way. You then monitor their performance. And if they're doing the job in the one best way, the way in which they're supposed to be doing it, you then compensate them. You provide them with pay for their performance. However, if they're not doing the job in the one best way, then they are merely cogs in the machinery and they're like a broken cog. So we take them out of the machinery, we throw them away, we put a new cog in the machinery, and the machinery will then start working efficiently and effectively again. So it's a relatively dehumanizing approach taken toward individual human beings. But the idea under Taylor was that if we focus on the work process and we come up with this one best way to do the job, that will then make us effective and efficient as an organization. So Weber and Taylor both share this focus on coming up with the one solution, the one panacea that can be applied to all organizations to make them effective. The difference between Weber and Taylor is Weber said we could do it through the structure of the organization. Taylor said we could do it through the process of work and by standardizing the process of work within the organization. Then another group of theories, people like Luther Gulick and Henri Fayol, contributed to what we refer to as the principles approach to organization theory. And in the principles approach, what we would do is we would come up with the skills that are necessary for managers. We would then teach those skills to our managers, and that will then make them effective managers, which in turn will then make for effective organizations. So the idea, especially under someone like Luther Gulick, was this idea that you've probably heard about ad nauseum before, and that's the principal school known as POSCORB, that acronym that stands for Planning, Organizing, Staffing, Directing, Coordinating, Reporting, and Budgeting, POSCORB. And that POSCORB represents the universe of the skills needed to be an effective manager. The idea here is if we could then teach our managers how to do these skills effectively, then they'll become effective managers, which then in turn will make our organizations effective. The similarity again between Weber, Taylor, and then the people in the principal school like Gulick is that they were looking for this one-size-fits-all type of an approach for organizational effectiveness. The difference, Weber looked at structure, Taylor looked at work processes. The principal school, Gulick and Fayol, looked at the tools that managers need in order to be effective. If we can teach them these tools, then we can make them effective managers, which will lead to effective organizations. Again, that one thing that really does tie all those classical theories of organization together is this one-size-fits-all type of an approach. Find that panacea you can apply to all organizations in order to make those organizations effective. Another unifying theme that ties all those classical theories together is kind of the dehumanizing approach to individual employees. And the goal of the organization is what mattered. We want to achieve the goal of the organization to make the organization effective. We didn't really care a whole lot about the goals of individual employees. Our focus was on the effectiveness of the organization. Because the classical school was so dehumanizing and really kind of overlooked the human element, it gave rise to another school of organization theory known as the human relations school. And the human relations school was generated out of this criticism of the dehumanizing approach that was taken by the classical theorists. So for the human relations theorists, in order to be effective as an organization, you needed to start thinking about your individual employees and taking your individual employees and their satisfaction into account in order to make your organization effective. But the definition of effectiveness was still the same. Are you achieving organizational goals? So it was very much of a goal attainment type of focus to the effectiveness of the organization. Now, some of the authors that you've probably read about before in the program that contribute to this human relations approach, people like one of my favorite authors, Mary Parker Follett. And it's kind of hard for me to not talk a lot about Mary Parker Follett, but I'm going to try not to just because it doesn't really fit the scope of this class. But Mary Parker Follett was one of the people, if not the only person in the 1920s, to really stand up and take issue with Frederick Taylor and scientific management. Follett was very disturbed with how dehumanizing scientific management was. Again, she didn't like this idea of treating individual employees as just being cogs in the machinery that were just replaceable parts in the machinery of the organization. Follett believed that the most appropriate way to operate our organizations to make them effective is by running them as what she called democratic organizations. Follett wanted to run our organizations as democratic organizations and run them kind of the way in which we run a democratic form of government. Well, in a democratic form of government, democracies are based upon what principle? What's the basic underlying principle of a democracy? What makes a government a democracy? How do we know it's a democracy?
To vote?
Yeah, right. Yeah, the voting, participation, kind of writ large participation on the part of citizens. In a democracy, especially in a one that's based on social contract theory like our system is, power is assumed to reside with the people. And so people then give up power to government in order to allow government to use that power judiciously to benefit the people. But the people are basically the repository of power. So people participate in their own governance. And like you said, the primary way people participate in a democracy is by voting. It's not the only way to participate. You could run for office, you could donate money, you could work on a campaign, you can do a lot of different things to participate. But the lowest cost participation method, especially here in California now, is voting. And so that's how people usually participate. So Follett wanted to run our organizations as democratic organizations predicated on the idea of employee participation. So Follett understood that in a democracy, there are two major flaws in a democracy. One major flaw in a democracy is that citizens tend to be relatively passive, that they will choose the participation that is the least costly to them. And they oftentimes don't participate in their own governance. And we see that today in our system. You know, we may have, even in a national election, we may have voter turnout rates of 50 or 60%. And that's a good voter turnout rate. Local elections, they used to be in the single digits. I mean, the school board that I served on, while I was on the board, we moved our elections from odd year to even year elections. We used to have our elections in odd years where the only issues on the ballot, the only offices on the ballot were basically just local offices, school board, you know, sewer district, judges, things like that, just very low intensity types of issues that people didn't really care a whole lot about. And so in odd year elections, we would have voter turnout rates in the range of anywhere from about 4 to 5 to 6%, single digits. As soon as we moved our elections to even years, that number went up to 46%. And so people tend not to participate, and 46% was a lot better than 4%, but it's still a majority of people who are eligible to participate chose not to participate, because people tend to be passive. So you have to encourage them to participate in their own governance. And then the second problem with a democracy is what you call particularized interest. And by particularized interest, she's basically talking about things like factions, that people will have certain interests that will run counter to the interests of others. So she says, if we are going to run our organizations as a democratic organization, we need to encourage participation on the part of our employees. When we encourage participation because of these particularized interests, we're going to end up creating conflict. And she said the best way to deal with conflict is through a process she called integration. So if we can get everyone together, we can get everyone sharing their thoughts, sharing their ideas, ideas will interpenetrate between people. We can then take all these ideas and we can integrate them together into a new way of solving a problem or a new way of doing a function. And by creating this new way, we can then get everyone to buy in to this new approach to how we are going to solve this problem. But Follett really believed in employee participation. She thought in order to be effective as an organization, we needed to have a good system of communication whereby we can empower people to participate in their own self-governance and their own self-direction. Again, that is a major change from what we saw from the classical school, in that effectiveness now under Follett is predicated upon employee participation in their own self-governance. Another very famous human relations theorist, who I'm sure you've heard about before, is Elton Mayo. And Elton Mayo is best known for his Hawthorne experiments. And the Hawthorne experiment, he went into the Hawthorne electrical plant and he decided he was going to see the impact that an external stimulant would have on productivity levels. So he said, let's go into this plant, let's turn the lighting level up. If we turn the lighting level up, people become more productive. If we turn the lighting level down, we'd assume people become less productive. He turned the lights up, people became more productive. He turned the lights down, people became even more productive, and productivity went up even though the lights went down. And the reason for that was obviously the social aspect of an organization. He was paying attention to these folks, he was talking to them, he was asking them about their opinions, he was putting them into groups and allowing groups to motivate the members of their group. He recognized that organizations are social environments. So for Mayo, to make your organization effective, you had to embrace the social aspects of an organization and recognize that people had social needs and that you had to, as an organization, help people meet these social needs in order to make them more effective, which in turn would then make the organization more effective as well. Now, with Follett as well as with Mayo, the ultimate goal is still an organizational goal. The ultimate goal is still to make the organization effective at achieving its goals. So it's still an organizational type of focus. It's just that the human relations theorists really started to focus more on employee participation. in making for an effective organization. Another theorist is Abraham Maslow. And again, one you've probably run into before, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where Maslow tells us every employee has a different hierarchy of needs. The bottom level usually have physiological needs such as food and water. Next level up, you have safety needs, the need to feel safe and secure from harm. Moving up from there, you have belonging needs, the need to feel that you belong to a group or something bigger than yourself. Next level up, esteem, you need to feel like you're held in high esteem by others and that people respect you for who you are. And at the very top level of his hierarchy of needs was what he called self-actualization. The bottom four needs were all what he called deficiency needs, and people were motivated by deficiencies. So if you could identify what these people were deficient in, you could then, by providing this to them, you could then motivate them to move up to their next level of needs. And it was a way you could motivate your employees. The top level, the self-actualization, is what he called a growth need. And this is something that will continue for employees. And the employees will always strive to be all that they can be and to become the best version of themselves. So with Maslow, you're starting to shift the focus a little bit away from just what's best for the organization and shift it more to looking as well at what is best for individual employees. McGregor, who really was a big believer in Abraham Maslow, is best known for his theory X and theory Y. Everybody familiar with theory X and theory Y and what they say? Does that ring a bell with anyone? Theory X and theory Y?
Theory X is when, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's when it's the belief that employees are not motivated and they need like incentives. And theory Y is that the opposite of that, that employees do come with their gifts and their skills, and it's the responsibility of management to kind of uplift them in that and empower them in the workplace using those gifts.
Exactly. That's perfect. I couldn't say it better myself. That theory X is, as you said, people are lazy, they're not very creative, they're not very intelligent. It's a very negative view of employees. Theory Y is just the opposite of that. It's a very positive view of employees, that they are creative, they are innovative, that they don't shy away from work, that they do aspire to higher level positions. The problem for McGregor is that organizations tended to be theory X organizations, and employees tended to be theory Y employees. So we were essentially shoehorning theory Y employees into theory X organizations. Obviously, if you're shoehorning a theory Y employee into a theory X organization, your theory Y employees are going to feel very unempowered. They're going to feel very dissatisfied, very unhappy with where they're working and what they are doing, which will then lead to an ineffective organization. So to be effective, you really need to transform your theory X organization into more of a theory Y organization that would really fit all these characteristics of theory Y employees. And a student of Douglas McGregor by the name of Chris Ardress picked up that theory and extended it through what he called his personal growth theory. And according to Ardress, not only are people theory Y, but they become more theory Y as they go through their natural maturation process. As people mature, as people grow, they become even more theory Y in nature. They go through this personal growth phase where they start to focus more on longer term as opposed to shorter term goals. They begin to aspire to superordinate, superior level positions. They take on more responsibility and more accountability. They start being more concerned about those around them and their community than just trying to get ahead as an individual. And Ardress says it's up to the organization. Effective organizations are organizations that are able to help employees progress through this personal growth type of process. So the importance here is that the definition of effectiveness has now shifted. It's no longer just the organization achieving its goals, but is now also helping employees achieve their goals as well. In a couple of weeks, actually, in 2 weeks, we will talk about a model of organizational effectiveness known as the participant satisfaction model. And the participant satisfaction model, we are defining effectiveness as how satisfied our relevant stakeholders are with what they are receiving from the organization. So when we are satisfying the personal growth needs of our employees are important internal internal stakeholders. And if we are able to satisfy their wants, needs, and desires, that is another way of achieving effectiveness as an organization. So it's kind of like that John F. Kennedy, they kind of put a turn on a phrase that, ask not just what you can do for the organization, but what the organization can also do for you. Then as the organization theory literature continued to evolve, it then moved into this idea known as the system school. And you've probably covered the system school before. The system school looks at the environment, both internal to the organization as well as external to the organization, as determinants of organizational effectiveness. The natural systems approach to systems theory looks at organizations as being akin to living organisms. And every living organism, from the moment it is born, its goal is for survival. And it tries to survive as long as it possibly can survive. So in the natural systems approach, the focus is on achieving the balance within the organization to help that organization survive into the future. Achieving that balance, that point of balance in systems theory, is what's known as the point of homeostasis. Homeostasis is that point at which the organization is in balance with itself. It's kind of what we would call organizational harmony. And so effective organizations have achieved this point of homeostasis. They have achieved this point of organizational harmony. Another approach to systems theory is called open systems theory. And open systems theory has a lot of similarities to natural systems theory, but the big difference is in open systems theory, we really pay more attention to the external as compared to the internal environment. It really kind of shifts our focus outside of the walls of the organization. In open systems theory, that point of balance, that point of homeostasis, is the balance between the organization and its external environment. The environment can obviously impact the organization, as we talked about a little while ago, talking about environmental capacity and environmental stability and consensus. It can have an impact upon the organization, but the organization can also have an impact upon the environment. And one of the ways in which the organization can impact its environment in terms of effectiveness is by pulling in resources from the environment. The better the organization is able to pull resources in from the environment, the more effective that organization is. So if the organization is able to enhance its budget by bringing in more fiscal resources, if it's able to bring in a well-qualified labor pool and different perspectives and diverse perspectives from the environment into the organization, those are all measures of organizational effectiveness. Bringing resources from the environment into the organization is what open systems theorists refer to as negative entropy. And entropy is the process of, as a living organism ages, it dissipates energy out into its environment. And through the entropy process, as it dissipates energy into the environment, eventually it's going to essentially run out of energy. And once it runs out of energy and resources, then that organism will go out of existence. It will then die. Well, for natural systems theorists, that's what would happen to an organization. Eventually, it's going to, as it ages, give out its energy, run out of resources, and die. For open systems theorists, you have negative entropy, in that that energy that's given out by the organization can then be replaced by bringing new energy and new resources from the environment into the organization, through this process known as negative entropy. So what the open systems perspective does is it gives us a different way of looking at organizational effectiveness. Now, organizational effectiveness is not just merely, did we achieve our goals? It's not just merely how satisfied are our stakeholders, Now, a measure of effectiveness can be how well are we pulling resources from the environment into our organization? What's known as the systems resource model of organizational effectiveness. So you compare where you were with where you are now in terms of resources. If you've been able to draw a lot of resources from your environment that will help your organization survive, then you have achieved effectiveness under this systems resource type of a model. And again, that's another model of organizational effectiveness that we're going to talk about when we get back together again in 2 weeks. But that's the systems perspective, kind of looking at where the organization sits in terms of its environment. Another school of organization theory that I think is important for us in our understanding of organizational effectiveness is the school of structural contingency. And I don't know if you covered this school before when you talked about organizational behavior theory, but structural contingency theorists make the argument that there's no one best way of structuring or organizing our organization, that there are different factors that can affect the most appropriate way to structure our organization for effectiveness. Factors such as environmental uncertainty, as we've talked about before tonight. Factors such as technical factors in terms of the technology that's being used by our organization in creating its outputs and creating its products, its goods, and its services. Staying on the cutting edge of technology in the creation of goods and services. Some goods and services require cutting edge technology. Some goods and services rely upon older technologies. It really depends upon the organization. The size of the organization will have an impact upon how you can make that organization effective. Smaller organizations tend to run better with a flatter hierarchy. Large organizations tend to need some type of a very tall hierarchy in order to be effective. Different organizations have different strategies, and so strategy can have an impact upon effectiveness. Resource dependence, how independent or dependent are you on your environment for your resources? You're getting all your resources from grants. Those grants can be relatively unstable, and if those grants are relatively unstable, your organization may be unstable in terms of its reliance upon those resources, which is a challenge for the effectiveness of the organization. Public accountability. Some organizations are held more accountable to the public than other organizations. The more accountable you are, the more transparency is required. That's going to have an impact upon how you measure and define effectiveness. So the importance of the structural contingency approach is it's kind of the end of this one-size-fits-all approach. It says that there's no one way in which to structure your organization or to run your organization to make it effective. It really depends upon the contingency that you find yourself in and the context of your organization and the situation in which you find yourself. So it's kind of the death of that one-size-fits-all approach. Another important school of organization theory that impacted the public sector was this school of quality management, whereby effectiveness was defined as the quality of the product that's being created. Now, obviously, quality management applies a lot better in the private sector than it does in the public sector. We've got a lot of barriers to the proper implementation of quality management in the public sector. But it's important here because in the school of quality management, we are defining effectiveness by the inherent quality of the products that we are creating as an organization. Again, much more difficult to do in the public as compared to the private sector. And another school of organization theory that I think has direct bearing on our discussion of effectiveness is the school of organizational culture. And this is one of my favorite schools in the organization behavior literature. And organization culture school argues that every organization has its own unique culture. And in order to make an organization effective, you need to understand the unique culture within that organization. And when we talk about culture, we're talking about shared values and norms and expectations for behavior. Societies have their own cultures. Political systems have their own cultures, and organizations have their own cultures as well. There are essentially three different levels of organization culture. The surface level of organization culture is called artifacts. And so every organization creates its own artifacts. Artifacts are things such as minutes for meetings, agendas for meetings. Those are what we consider to be the artifacts of the organization. They're very visible, they're very easy to see, and very easy to measure. So just like if you're on an archaeological dig to learn about the culture of an ancient society, you would dig up eating utensils and things like that. Those would be artifacts. Our organizations create artifacts as well. Then a deeper level of organization culture is what's called espoused values. Espoused values is when the organization tells you what they value. So here are our goals, and usually these are going to be expressed in a strategic plan, maybe a mission statement, a vision statement. Those are the espoused goals of the organization. But then at the deepest, most difficult to access level of culture is what we call the basic assumptions. These are assumptions that we all share as individual employees, but we don't talk a whole lot about. So a basic assumption that we all share may be that we treat each other in a civil manner. We may not have a civility code, but we all assume that we're going to treat each other in a collegial and a civil manner. We don't talk about it a lot, but it's a natural expectation for behavior that we all share kind of quietly as an organization. The importance of organization culture is, again, it's the death of the one-size-fits-all approach to making organizations effective. We have to understand the shared values and norms, the culture of the organization, before we can know how to make that organization effective in what it does on a daily basis. And I think that discussion of the organization theory literature contributes nicely to our understanding of effectiveness, because it really shows us that we have really moved away from just a focus on internal environments. And we understand that in order to make our organizations effective, we need to understand the relationship between the organization and its larger external environment. The evolution of the organization theory literature has also told us that we need to recognize the contextual nature of organizational effectiveness, that it really does depend upon different organizations. Alan asked the question, can assumptions in organizations be seen similarly as social contracts? Absolutely, and that's another great way to put it. These are social contracts between members of the organization. They're not necessarily as visible as you might have with the Constitution, but they are implicit contracts between members of the organization. And I do think that's a great way to visualize it. There's a recognition of the multiplicity of determinants of effectiveness. There's just not one definition of effectiveness. There are multiple ways that we can define effectiveness. Granted, we usually define effectiveness in what we call the goal attainment approach, where we define effectiveness as how well have we achieved our goals, how much progress have we made toward achieving our stated goals. And admittedly, that's a very common way of measuring effectiveness. But as we've seen from this discussion of the development of organization theory, there's also the systems resource approach that comes out of the systems model, where we are asking the question, how does our organization relate with its environment? How effective has it been in pulling in new resources from the environment? We said human relations models have given us this idea of a participant satisfaction definition of effectiveness, that we can measure our effectiveness by how satisfied our key stakeholders are in what they are getting out of the organization. And so there's a multiplicity of different ways in which we can measure effectiveness. And we'll talk about those different approaches when we get together again in 2 weeks. But most of all, I think what this development of organization theory literature has done is it's shown us that we are no longer looking for the one best way to make our organizations effective. We have recognized that it will depend upon the individual organization and the situation in which the organization finds itself. There is no one magic bullet, if you will, to make all organizations effective. But I think it's important for our understanding of effectiveness to recognize that where we are today in terms of measuring organizational effectiveness is really the result of over 150 years of the development of the organization theory literature that really gives us multiple ways in which we can measure effectiveness in our public organizations. And again, we get together in 2 weeks. In the second half of class, we will talk about 4 different models of measuring organizational effectiveness, goal attainment, systems resource, participant satisfaction, and then a fourth model called the internal process model. And just to demonstrate that there are different ways in which we can measure and achieve effectiveness in our organizations. And I know you said we usually go to 8 o'clock and we're at 8:03. I apologize for that. I thought I could land the plane on time at 8 o'clock, and I missed by about 3 minutes. So I apologize for taking up 3 extra minutes. But any other observations or comments on this whole idea of the contribution of the organization theory literature to our understanding of effectiveness, and how important an understanding of internal and external environments are to understanding the effectiveness of our organizations? Any other comments or observations or anything before we wrap it up for the evening? Okay. Well, yeah, I hope this was helpful in creating this context for you in terms of understanding effectiveness. In 2 weeks, when we get back together again, we will not only talk about the 4 models of effectiveness, but we'll also talk about the contribution that missions and strategic plans and goals and objectives make to the effectiveness of our organization, and how central it is for us to have good goal clarity and good goal consensus for making our organizations as effective as they can possibly be. Remember, your background paper is then due on June 18th, and then you have Canvas essay number 2 also due on June 18th. And then the following week, Canvas essay number 3 will be due, and then we'll be back together again on the 26th. Okay? Okay.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much. Thanks
thank
for
you.
putting up with a few extra minutes in class, but I'll have the recording up on our site no later than tomorrow morning. So thanks, everybody. Have a great week, and I'll
Very
talk to
much.
you in 2 weeks. Thanks.
a
Thank
great
you.
evening.
Very
Take care.
informative
Bye-bye.
lecture.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks. Take care.